once again. This is Breckenridge Elkins on Stumbling Radio. We have another interesting broadcast. As I like to stress, we're very solutions-oriented on Stumbling Radio, and we're going to deal with solutions tonight. Facts, the basis of action. That's where my whole interest lies. Now, I have been conducting some sociological experiments because I consider myself a psychologist. One might call myself a literary psychologist. Might as well. It's a term anyway. I don't want to bore you. We're going from here. For state a thesis, state a solution. State a point, and then state a reality. This means what? This means what action must be taken. Just for all of the 21st century, or 20th century rather, we had this situation in which the supreme object or the supreme character or the supreme objective is to suppress the warrior, scholar, cool, collected, cold-blooded killer. I just happened to be watching an old episode of Miami Vice last night. And I was noting that the hero or the villain of this particular episode was a Peruvian? No, it was Chilean. He was Chilean. And he was, this of course is a reference to, I think it was Pinochet, and Pinochet, it was just, basically it was meant to demonize Chile, which at the time was still under some right-wing or conservative domination. But overall, you had this guy, he's very white for being a South American, and he wears these leather glasses, these leather gloves, what am I saying, leather glasses, and these dark glasses. He's very conveys this impression of coolness, of serenity, he has it all together, immense pride, immense arrogance. He's an aristocrat, he's a police official, and he's this figure which typifies just about every Hollywood villain. He's this Nazi. People would say, they demonize the Nazi, but here you have this old fellow. What am I saying? This old fellow, this young fellow, this in 1980s on a popular TV show that is the carbon copy of the Nazis, but he comes from South America and he's not blonde. But he could, fit into the SS. Other than that, he's probably Jewish. The actor was probably Jewish. He has these kind of off features, but who knows? But the point is, this is the kind of guy they demonize. The gloves, the classic gloves, the suit, the impeccably fitting suit, the air of assurance that comes with, killing a half dozen people, fighting, being able to kill very coolly, and this air of erudition, it's quite extraordinary, and it's only possible to realize the endless possibilities that these stereotypes offer us. And basically, this is what's kind of interesting here, these stereotypes that interest us right in front of us, that are in front of us right now, because the only way to deal with them is to realize them once again. Now, the notion has been put forth and has been furthered by the U.S. Army. Well, it was put forth by Hollywood, obviously, but it's been furthered by the U.S. Army that just about anyone is capable of martial prowess. That doesn't mean they can be a hero. Well, of course, everybody can be a hero in today's age, but they can fight effectively. They can be effective combatants, and when the circumstances demand. Now, when the circumstances demand, we will have routines and rituals that will produce the superior fighting man who carries these out. These are, this old World War II era theory, but it's like the portrayal of the man of peace, who is the hero, baseball to death. That is amazing, Hodge. Amazing. I really got to give Hodge Backmaker credit. He is huge cultural references. He's almost replaced Ozeb as our cultural guru on Stumble In. But I was just watching, kind of skimming through because it was kind of one of these surreal things. But anyway, I was playing guitar and I was watching this old videotape of a sermon, and it actually cut into Miami Vice. But don't let me get off topic. This man of peace, the hero of all these films, is portrayed as this guy who only resorts to violence to revenge his family or for some other asinine or trite reason and or motive. And we notice at the end of these stories, what we have to notice is at the end of all these stories, things never get better. In the ending of every Hollywood movie, things never get better. What I'm talking about is all these films from the beginning of Hollywood's, say, after 1933, we might say post-Code, all these films like Mel Gibson in The Patriot, the movie The Patriot, things never get better. They either stay the same or they're more bleak, and that's kind of the modernist trends. Instead of letting things stay the same, instead of letting the guy go home to the hero go to home to the white picket fence deal, and having him, have a happy lifestyle. It's kind of unsure what's going to happen. It's kind of the indecision in the outlaw Josie Wales, which is a notable exception to the rule because the outlaw Josie Wales is kind of unique in a lot of ways. But for the most part, it typifies a lot of these other pictures that, how many movies can you have when the guy's avenging his family or avenging something else? He's just a man of peace. He's just plowing his fields, But anyway, in The Patriot, take The Patriot. Mel Gibson's movie, The Patriot. I haven't watched it, to be honest. I don't care for these middle-aged fantasies of these middle-aged men. But The Patriot is one of these movies, well, many will say something did change in the end. He effected this historical change. They won the war. But if you think about it, the Revolutionary War, and think about the Carolinan government before and after the war, nothing changed. Nothing changed in Carolina, and nothing altered itself. And the government was the same, the culture was the same. All that happened was that Carolina was invaded, and after a prolonged struggle, the invader was driven out. And this is why we cannot attempt to learn from American history or draw comparisons between, that time and any other age or of Whiggery, as we might say, Whiggery in the classic sense, not in the Lindstedian sense. But we certainly can't draw comparisons between that time and our current situation. But the point is, in the end of this movie, nothing changes for the better. And in the end of a lot of European movies on the same principles, everything gets bleaker. Nothing changes for the better because these men are incapable of changing things for the better. They're just not up for it. And this is why we don't really have any particular use for this whole idea of these middle-aged men taking up arms and overthrowing the government that exists, and it just typifies why it's utterly ridiculous to have this idea that these middle-aged men are going to rise and make a restoration. The only people who are actually capable of doing this are the villains. And there was that article I posted on Batman on how the Batman's villains are really traditionalist heroes, which I consider a stretch, but there's certainly the guy makes a credible case, and I don't consider it a stretch because I think it's not actually being done that way to intentionally prevent the rise of a traditionalist background or a traditionalist theory, as it were. We're going to criminalize it we're going to stamp down on it before it even pops up. But what I see it as is that things are going to be born anew. If things are going to be born anew, we might say, we have to go back to more primitive times to draw comparisons, because there are many races and peoples that once existed. Sixkiller brought up the Allens, I think, which he claims were the originators of the Asians, which could be or could be not. What always runs back to my mind is Alexis, I think it was the first, his mistress, Mary the Allen, and the Byzantium Empire was a veritable multicultural paradise because they left all these peoples in their regions. It's kind of interesting. I don't want to get sidetracked, but it's kind of interesting to note the Byzantium Empire. And this is way off topic, but I'm going to bring it up anyway, because if you note, in the Byzantium Empire, you have these various peoples with full access to travel, and yet they maintain their ethnic sovereignty, as it were. There's no miscegenation except among the nobility to a certain extent. And it's quite interesting to note that it's possible to have a multicultural empire of this sort. Now, of course, it didn't work in Byzantium in the long term, and the Muslims kind of wrecked that whole deal. But the point is, it's a pattern that we can actually learn from in that deal. But anyway, we note that there's so many peoples and races out there, and as I said, they're changing so radically that they will eventually bear no real resemblance, no recognizable resemblance, certainly, to the races of today. As, for example, I believe that in the future the Nordic races are going to become more Nordicized. What does that mean, more Nordicized? Well, for example, there will be more quotas for blondes and redheads. We will have quotas for people with blue eyes and green eyes and so forth and so on. I'm not going to get into that either, but the point is the races are going to, as we re-embrace the idea of sub-races and sub-ethnicities, they will become stronger, but and science will basically augment this with the next generation of scientists, which is what I'm going to get into. But to proceed, all this change is going to be initiated by whom? That's a leading question. Who is going to initiate this change? It's quite obvious that we could have made massive progress in the last 10 years had it not been for so many older people at the wheel. It's quite interesting to note also that technology is designed to facilitate the advance of the weak rather than the strong. All our technology, down to the lowest, it's partly economic too. Basically, for example, you know some deals, like certain rifles, for example. Take rifles, just plain rifles. A lot of these rifles can only be afforded by old men, and we're talking about old men. So they build these expensive hunting rifles, not the custom ones, but the more expensive ones, the ones that run over to $700 to $800 to $900, and some that go into $2,000. Your average guy under 40 can't afford them, and basically they don't really have a choice but to market and create these guns specifically to be used by old men. So we're basically holding back technology to favor the weak and the elderly and the infirm, rather than to get the best folks that technology will cooperate with them and get along with them. And so this is the way it goes, as we would say. We're being held back in every respect. Now, we have to realize that it's the same politically as it is technologically. People just don't decide to initiate the creation of a new regime because they're mad as hell and they can't take it anymore. They don't decide to revolt against the system for these reasons. They, they may do this individually, but they're not going to do it en masse. And the individuals who rebel, who we might say chimp out against the system, are either killed off or institutionalized. And some people would argue that there have been many spontaneous uprisings throughout history. I'm going to take a point here with Hodge Backmaker says the gun culture is graying, and I kind of remember this old story. Another one of our listeners might remember it also in chat or somewhere, but I think it was called Bad Day at Something Rock. It was kind of a rip-off of Bad Day at Black Rock, but it's about this young guy and his grandfather. This isn't a totalitarian regime where all the guns have been confiscated, and his grandfather takes him to the secret place where he has these books and guns stored. And it's a two-part story, very interesting, and it's in a liberal totalitarian society about 20 years in the future. It was written in the late 1990s, and it was quite an interesting story, two parts. I may look it up and try to post it, but I think it was called Coffin Rock. Could be wrong, Coffin Rock, Dead Coffin Rock. But the point is, yes, this is what I want to address tonight, the next generation. All these old people, all these old militia nuts, all these old men, they're all over 40, they're all over 50, they're useless. The best thing they can do is commit suicide. If they really want to aid the cause, they can commit suicide because they're good for nothing, basically. So what we have to deal with is not these old people. They're completely a waste of time. Some people would argue that there have been many spontaneous uprisings. Sundown at Coffin Rock, that's the story. That's what the story is called, Sundown at Coffin Rock. It makes a great movie. Make an interesting movie. Anyway, Sundown at Coffin Rock. Read parts 1 and 2. And basically, like I say, there are people like Libertine, who isn't here tonight, or is it Libertine, that would argue that there have been lots of spontaneous uprisings, and certainly Hollywood portrays the spontaneous uprising because it's kind of like managed resistance, as it were. You create your own resistance there, and give people the illusion that when we all just have enough, we're all going to rise up and take to the streets, because that's what happens in the movies when people have had enough oppression. But it doesn't actually happen that way. In Tiananmen Square, in all these cases, what happens is that what I notice is that there's a small cadre. I mean, with students, that's one thing. The students are themselves a cadre. And what happens with the old people is that knowledge is starting to skip a generation. You got these people in their 60s and 70s who have a lot of knowledge, and some even in their 80s that are still active to some extent. But the people from 40 to 65 are usually worthless. They don't have that knowledge. They aren't really capable of anything. These people who are in their 30s and 80s, you can just go by that and know that they were completely worthless. So the people who are in the 30s and the the 30s and the 80s and 90s, we can basically decide that they're functionally worthless. Anybody born, you could say, after 1955, they just don't have the same amount of knowledge or prowess or skills that a lot of these older folks who are just completely ancient. And they themselves are in a small category. I mean, they're only about less than 100,000 across the country, I'd say. I mean, I've talked to these old-timers, they'll tell me how many acres you can plow a day with a horse and plow, and this is valuable knowledge, and depending on the soil and the rocks and so on, how to hook up a horse properly, they did all this when they were kids, but the point is, And there's a lot of other more practical knowledge for the average person as well. But the point is, all these people are either dead or pretty old, and their knowledge is largely going to die with them, except for people like me who, go around and talk to them. But for the younger people, it's completely worthless. They're never going to do anything. The over 40s and the under, these older folks, they're completely worthless. So we have to realize that any understanding of history tells us that these younger, or these real history, we talk about real history. One of these ideas is that, liberal ideas, is that everyone should know history. And the reason they believe that, the reason they teach history in the schools is for this reason, is that they want to corrupt history. We understand that history is not something that can be taught to the masses like reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's more like medicine or engineering, but, they know that popularizing history is a means of destroying it. It's like popularizing literature. Look what they did to literature. There's no such thing as literature anymore. It's dead. Look at the movies. I mean, they at one time they'll talk about how they tried to make good movies and they have to have mass appeal. They use the masses as an excuse partly and partly as a weapon. But regardless of that, what we have here is not a hard and fast rule, obviously, because we have a lot of, in our own society, we have a lot of generals and engineers and an acute shortage of doctors. But for whatever reason, the latter professions have not lost their credibility. But the only reason this hasn't happened, these engineers and generals are still employed, is because they don't really actually function in their occupation or roles. If they did, we'd need a lot fewer engineers and generals, because we have far too many. It's just basically a waste of time, the number of engineers, lawyers, and generals we have. But engineers and generals can be more dangerous than lawyers in some situations. But something like history has long since been degraded to just something so low. The young average listener cannot really, bring any historical evidence to the table to support their claims about popular uprisings, because they're not really even capable of interpreting the evidence, and you don't necessarily even, have the resources to produce the evidence in the first place. So all this tells us is that the current living generations are basically incapable of freeing themselves, and they've been willing to live in our current totalitarian system for 40 years or more, 30 years or more, and this makes them unfit to be a sovereign people and to establish a sovereign nation or a region or whatever have you. So in order to overthrow this system and institute a new one, you have to have a sovereign people. And only a sovereign people can do this. Only an autonomous people can do this. Only autonomous individuals can do this as one-on-one. Now, we have to behave like insects. This is my first precept tonight. All I've said up to now is destroying the arguments that can be used against my case. Now, what I'm going to say now is that what we have to do is, or basically go into what we have to do. We have to be like insects. What do insects do? They lay their eggs that hatch after their deaths. That's what they do. This is what we have to do. And the genes, I think it was I'm not even going to go there. I don't want to discuss that. I don't want to quote that because I can't speak French and I can't pronounce the guy's name. But he basically said, even if liberty was completely stamped out and, completely stamped out of the human mind, somebody would reinvent it. And, this is certainly the case. And certainly the case in this situation. So what happens is that it's impossible to destroy the genetics for liberty-minded individuals and personal sovereignty, and that will always exist, but without the background, without training and discipline and traditional values. And when I say traditional values, I of course mean back to the beginning of time, beginning of mankind, the traditional law, common law, all this, the laws of men, the laws of what's his name. Basically, these genes are worse than an impediment to each individual who bears them. Each generation is worse than the last, and they can't really. Oh, thank you, Hodge. Etienne de la Boati. Don't ask me how you pronounce it. I had a feeling Hodge was going to get it, but yeah, the generations can't facilitate the rebirth of a noble society if each generation is worse than the last. They'll have to sacrifice, one generation is going to have to sacrifice their lives, and this happens periodically. They don't do it intentionally, obviously, but they end up sacrificed, and there will be a recreation or a baptism by fire and blood, as I like to call it, baptism by fire and blood, a recreation that happens. And there's a great scene in the end of Six String Samurai when the protagonist is killed in the end after a journey with this little boy. It's kind of like a proving trail and path to destiny, and the little boy who's been following him throughout the film has developed this attachment to him, and he puts on his clothes in the end and picks up his sword and guitar after having avenged him. By the way, that's a predominating point in the film. He avenges him, and then he puts on his garments, his garb, and takes his guitar and sword and continues on the trek. He's approaching Las Vegas, and you got to see the movie. But it's an interesting analogy to what I have in mind, because what I have in mind is to raise this generation of sovereign individuals. We have to plan to shed our blood and plan ahead, have these ideas that seemed far-fetched in our feminine, animalistic era. People don't like it, not one bit. They say it's crazy. What does Commander say? It's a matter of resources. Put your efforts into things that are plausible. Pipe dreams are just that, pipe dreams. Well, I have some plausible solutions tonight. When people plan ahead, they do so instinctively and economically in our society. And this is what our good friend Commander Chimpout does, actually. People plan in our society like squirrels. They stockpile their nuts for the winter, for their last years. And everyone does this because they're compelled to work. They're instinctively compelled to work all their lives for nothing more than what a rodent would deem sufficient. That's an old line. It may sound canned. That's because I wrote it a long time ago. I just come back to my mind. Now, they're really opposed to these ideas I have for the future, because new ideas are virile and masculine, and they always challenge and threaten the order that exists. And women of both sexes are very averse to change, partly because they are incapable of creating means of change, and they know these means often lead to violence. So ideas are called insane and impossible by women and feminine men, for this very reason. Now, planning ahead, when I talk about planning ahead or plotting, strategizing, all those under 40 need to concentrate on children from the age of 10 to 0 or 0 to 10. Basically, these are the kids who matter, the kids from 0 to 10 years old of today, living. The ideal of raising these children is through the family. That's our preferred method of raising these children. And even I, who hate children, hate families, have actually been involved working with activists for home birth and various other legal aspects that threaten the family. And so I'm just mentioning that because that's how important I believe the family is. But we cannot rely on the family in its entirety. And I'm just reading a quote here. And but basically, we cannot rely on the family. There are millions of children today that come from a positive or have positive genetics, and it's very difficult because we have almost 3 generations of state-raised orphans today. And, when I say a lot of millions of children, very people know, we've gone over how few people know what a nuclear, genuine, traditionalistic family is. And there are only, I would say, less than 500,000 to 1 million real families in the whole of the United States. And people would wonder, how do I get those figures? Well, I'm going by partially evangelistic churches and partially by church membership, and basically these are extreme micro-churches in themselves, micro-denominations, the smaller denominations. And I'm also going by the voter statistics for the Constitution Party in my own experience traveling and working with religious and political institutions. I estimate the true traditionalistic families between 500,000 and 1 million. And bear in mind, these are not wholly traditionalistic families. They have aspects of modernism among them, which Fenian and I have gone into in the chat box before about this misplaced paternalism, which often leads to wrong behavior. And so no problem. But anyway, the point is, families are the best means, and you have to work with these families that currently exist. But we must, beyond this, have to deal with all these orphans, basic orphans, because they were raised by 2 people who didn't know how to be parents. They were raised by people who didn't know how to be men or women. And this has gone on for 3 generations since the 1950s, and to some extent prior to that. So we have all these kids, one generation after another. We have old kids in our society, courtesy of the Frankfurt School. And we have to concentrate on these orphans and the wards of the state. Now, people wonder, how do you go through half the broadcast and not mention your plan? Well, I got the plan right here. Don't worry, relax. Now, where do you find orphans in our society? Well, the single mothers are prime producers of orphans. Study dating sites, and I've done this for sociological research, and I've crunched the numbers so you don't have to, and I've worked it all out, and it's pretty obviously that there's a massive, nearly all dating sites are frequented principally by single mothers or working women. Working women are, these power-driven women who cannot, they're always busy, but they still feel the need of male companionship. But principally, we'll deal with the single mothers because they are hugely prevalent on these sites. Now, what we have to do is note that most of these single mothers, and once again, I've crunched the numbers so you don't have to, most of these single mothers have male children, at least one male child. And once again, we consider all these children orphans. They don't have families. They're atomized. They're essentially the progeny of cattle, and they're going to be raised by cattle. And might as well be raised raised with wolves. You're going to turn out better if you throw these kids out and let the wolves raise them. And so we have to gain control of the entire generation. And we have to gain control by eliminating the mothers from the equation, the dams, as we call them, with horses, and from the equation. Very easy to do this. We simply terminate the existence of the mothers, and I'm going to go into detail a little bit later. But what we want to do is to, one thing right off the bat, I'll say, the whole purpose of noting these match sites is that they promulgate information that basically is relevant to our choosing of the children. In other words, some children, we only want the children that are worth saving, in other words. We only want children with genetics that are leaning toward our direction. And one thing about the general trend of things is that mostly only conservatives are having children. So basically we have a system right now that it's like they say, when guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns. Well, people only have children, as I said before, for only two reasons: because of instinct, or because they're actually in revolt against the system. A lot of liberals, are really just left conservative, peasant conservative types that have been indoctrinated. And so basically no true leftist is today having children. And this is what we talk about, how birth rates are falling. Well, the dirty secret, of course, is that middle classes and conservative classes are having children, up to replacement and a little more, I'd say. And, but we're not concerned with these. We're either going to slaughter these or they're going to, come on our side when the time comes. What we're concerned about is particularly these children, these orphans of these wards of the state, because all single mothers, whether they take federal money or federal welfare or not, are essentially wards of the state. So what we have to do, as I said, is particularly concentrate on this vast number of children, because there are literally millions of children who fit into these categories. And we can start, as I said, there are millions of people using these dating sites, and we can start by taking the children from these women to begin with. Now, we once again use the social networks to basically form genetic pictures by all the information their mothers put up on their profiles, that to give us various knowledge about the child, because what their mothers are, that tells us something about the child. And it'll also, in many cases, will say, I'm tired of drama, tired of having 3 or 4 husbands, 3 or 4 boyfriends. It's tired of it. So that tells us that the child's father, even if she doesn't talk about him, is essentially an aggressive person who is not father material, because he's just an overgrown boy, but nevertheless he's capable of siring some child that could turn out, with the proper training, to be a superior person. It's like the Jesuits used to say, give me a child for 7 years, or what the hell ever, and we'll work that out. But the thing is, once again, with these individuals, you have these individuals, each one, there's so few individuals out there capable of dealing with it. Now, when I say we take these kids out of their of these single-parent households, these millions of young women who are wards of the state, what are you going to do with them? Well, it's a benefit to everybody, because you may note that all these women are essentially useless. I try to stress this, how superfluous women are in society. Utterly superfluous, utterly useless. Nobody really cares about them. And, I occasionally feel sad for these single mothers, especially the ones who are in Christian churches and so on. Not enough to do anything for them, obviously, but I feel a vague, kind of sorrow for their children, at least, not so much for them, because even if they've reformed, they're still worthless. But you get rid of these people, nobody's going to miss them. That doesn't mean you're not going to be committing a crime, or nobody's literally going to be missing them, but nobody's going to miss them. And this is a good thing, because it will basically not only remove these women from the gene pool, it will also remove them from the workforce. It's like killing abortionists, Who misses an abortionist? Yeah, we'll hold a memorial for him. Yeah, we'll try the person who killed him, because it's against the law to kill abortionists. But nobody really cares. That's the spiritual part of this thing. We're spiritually removing these people from the world. Now, they're only about, when I talk about taking these children away and raising them in rebellion to the system, this is a profound act of rebellion. And it's not a job for any one group. I'm not suggesting we form a group tomorrow and, do this, because there's no one true way. There's a traditional way, but that makes allowances for variations and differentiation. Tradition embraces diversity. And so I'm not saying, one group is all there is. There's no one true way, as I said. And there's only, in any case, only about 1,000 individuals in the entire United States of America who are capable of, undertaking a project of this immense scale, of this immense task. But just imagine you get 1,000 of these individuals together, each one is responsible for 5 to 10 children. And after the first year, these kids will be pretty independent and autonomous, or they'll be dead, and pretty skilled as well. They'll be better skilled, I would say, than the average U.S. Marine. And then we can use them to alleviate the burden on the adult teachers. And then that will allow for, bringing in more children. And, that's the problem. Now, the problem of where to educate the children, where to take them, is the biggest problem. Obviously, it has to be in a harsh physical environment that is, very defensible from the system. And people say that's impossible. Look at Randy Weaver. Look at this. Look at that. Well, it isn't actually hard as many might think. Randy Weaver was living in a shack, and he wasn't doing a very good job of it. And it was only him also. In our case, we're going to have at least 100 people to start with. Now, what do you do with these 100 people? What do you do with 50 people? You choose a mountainous region, first of all. You make sure it's only traversable. The only routes to it, around it, are only traversable via four-wheel drive vehicles. And then, once you've established an idea of the region, you ditch all the trails and all the roads that are not regularly traversed, but that lead to positions near your place. And you ditch them good and deep, at least 8 or to 10 feet deep. And what this enables us to do is we can carry our drawbridges with us. In other words, I've done this many times. You take two heavy oak boards, and that'll take, I don't know. It'll take a good ton, I guess. Well, better be safe, say half ton. But they'll say, the federal government does this to keep people out of certain wilderness regions. So it's not like I'm developing this scheme out of thin air. This is, done by the government right now. Now, next thing out, we want to pick a region, say a 10-mile stretch, and make sure that it's home to some endangered species of lizard or something. And that will, prevent bombing, because the next thing after you ditch the roads is you get some of these old artillery pieces and AA guns and modify them for defense, and then you can stand off anything except the U.S. Army. And basically, that's your last stand in any case, but with the U.S. Army doesn't know how to deal with fortifications. That's what we learned in Afghanistan. The U.S. Army has no idea what to do against fortifications except to bomb them. So it's, like I said, the best reason for picking a spot with an endangered species on it is that they will be loath to bomb or loath to order a bombing, because the Army will bomb anywhere, but the politicians will be loath to order a bombing on such regions. And then you build your retreats. You keep everything fairly mobile, because you don't want to get pinned down within that 10-mile radius. You don't want to get, you don't want to have too many buildings. In any case, you have the kids sleep out as much as possible. You live hard. It's going to be very tough life, and the survivors will be superior people when they come out. And you repeat the process. It doesn't need to be one particular location of this deal, but this is what goes on. But this is what will happen in any case. That's certain. Now, what we have to deal with beyond that is something resembling the Camp of Saints. And in the Camp of Saints, it all comes down to the whole country goes to pot, and during the invasion, and you have these six guys, I think it's a professor and 3 paratroopers and some other guy, and the rest of the country is completely gone. And the whole nation is spiritually corrupt. The whole nation literally crumbles under the idea of a armada of third world immigrants. And what this tells us, what I'm actually getting at here is at the end, these 6 guys end up at this little chateau in the country, and they get bombed, I think, but they're really tough fighters, and they stand off some attacks, and then they get bombed from the air by the French Air Force when the government's taken over. But we're in a similar dire straits in this continent, and we have to seize control not of the state, but of the youngest generation's mind. We have to seize control of their mind. The only way we can really wrest it away from the system that exists is by force. And, the reason I'm forced, when I say force, right off the bat, people say violence. Force does not necessarily mean violence. It may include violence, but force is based on strength. It's like a wind. You talk about a violent wind. Yeah, so there's such a thing as a violent wind. A violent wind is just a strong wind. See, automatically our semantic mind of the Western mind will place violent wind and strong wind as synonymous to one another, when in fact they are not synonymous. Forceful wind, you understand how this works. And, when the Pony Express, for example, I'm using this as an analogy, they put out a notice saying orphans preferred, and then they gave them this pledge which said they wouldn't smoke, or they had to sign this pledge that said they wouldn't smoke or drink or swear, and then they were given a Bible. And just about all these young men who didn't die young, quite a few of them died either working with the Pony Express or or during the Civil War, which immediately continued it or preceded it, is that they turned out quite well. Once again, we have this idea of the Jesuits, as they said, give me a child until he's 6 years old, and he will, I will control what he thinks or whatever, what have you there. And that's basically the way it works. You take these children away from their parents. You select them very carefully based on on the information their mothers put up about themselves, and that gives you a very good idea of what the child is going to be like. Now, training programs, these are details. I'm not really into details. I'm into theory. If I was going to do it, I really don't see this as a role for myself. It's kind of like the Mormons. The Mormons, what are they called? These Mormons in the polygamous Mormons, these traditional Mormons who go up in the mountains in Mexico and so on. They have their polygamous deal, and I don't have a problem with that, by the way. The left has had, we'll give them a century. They've had a century. We've been inundated with leftist vices, and now they're going to have to deal with some rightist vices, which is polygamy, among others. There will be a lot more violence against women. Most amusing. Evidently, there's been another shooting And say there's been this been a shooting between this crazed right-wing not according quote unquote and shot this guy and so on. It's been there's a siege going on. But what's interesting about this, I kind of remember the old preacher back in 2002 that he basically used to post on Frugal Squirrels, as I remember it. And I knew him somewhat, you know, he was just this old scruffy guy, you know, this kind of weird. May have been DSCI. Okay, the alleged shooter surrenders after West Odessa standoff. Odessa's a real awful town. I don't know why anyone would live in Odessa, Texas. It's one of those towns you're just not sure. Whoever comes from Odessa, does anything come from Odessa except Mexicans? You know what I mean? But anyway, you know, this old guy who's an old preacher, kind of like DSCI type, you know, he rebuked these scantily clad young women in '02, I think it was, or late '01 or something like that. And for some reason, his what he said to them or whatever was deemed inappropriate, and a deputy was there, and he got no scuffle with a deputy. I cannot remember his name for the life of me. But anyway, they had a big deal. I mean, he didn't show up for court, and then they sent in the SWAT team like they always did. I'm making a long story short, summary of it. But anyway, he had a big firefight with these people, and he escaped actually through a tunnel under his house, and he got shot in a deal with you know, after the manhunt about 3 weeks later. And the thing is, you know, this is the whole problem with lone wolf action. You know, lone wolves don't post on the internet. I know some lone wolves. They don't post on the internet. They don't. They are instinctive creatures. You can't be a lone wolf unless you're genetically predisposed to be a lone wolf. And lone wolves are just wolves. They're just completely out of it. They don't act. You know, I'm like a half wolf myself, and I'm like half wolf, half mongrel dog. But you know, I've only got half that instinct in me. You know, I can tell if somebody's, you know, looking at me when I'm not, you know, observing me from any distance, because I can just feel eyes on me. But you know, it's you know, one of those things. But for the most part, lone wolf action, complete waste of time. Don't even think about being a lone wolf. We definitely do not condone pointless violence. Pointless violence is violence that gets you killed for no spiritual good reason. No spiritual reason. What am I saying? Good reason. That's a lousy word. For no spiritual reason. This is what pointless violence does in the, you know, in the long run. You have to have a reason. I mean, this guy is just a little thing. Take this guy, alleged shooter. He just happened evidently. Let me see. He shot a. He was burned when a fire broke out in his trailer home. That's quite a fortification there. Trailer home. A tank is also on the scene to provide cover and assistance. And helicopters have been keeping an eye on the situation. This is why you need artillery. I would not dream of creating a fortification without artillery. And you need the anti-aircraft guns for the helicopters, and you need artillery pieces to control passes, keep the tanks mobile, because, you know, most of these tanks have no idea, tank drivers have no idea what to do with their tanks. So it's kind of strange. It's kind of strange, you know. You know, who knows why it happened, but, you know, this is a case of random, insane violence, you know. The guy really doesn't, you know, his ideology is kind of on the side, because people are rarely ideologically motivated, and this is the thing. We don't want to ideologically motivate these kids. We're not going to indoctrinate them with our traditionalistic beliefs. We're not going to indoctrinate them with religious beliefs. We're going to create autonomous individuals and let them go from there. We're going to create these kids who are trained to work as teams, who get along well. We're going to teach them skills, useful trades. We're going to teach them combat. We're going to teach them how to live. We're going to make them tough or they're going to die. And what this does is creates these kids who simply won't take it from the system. They're not going to take it. They're not going to they're capable of living outside the system. They don't need the system, first of all. They don't need the comforts of the system. They don't need the highways. They will have some exposure to technology, in my view. We're not trying to raise them to be Luddites either. We're just trying to raise these orphans. Let me kind of double up on that orphan business, because those kids who see their fathers once a week, people have no real idea how emotionally scarring is. I don't. I've always been, I had a traditional family upbringing, but I've always been a lone wolf myself. Family is not that big a deal to me. But to your average child, I've come to realize, working with these young people, they're seriously damaged by their current existence. So, people are going to die doing this, yes. Blood is going to be spilled, yes. I think we had established by now that these women are not completely human beings. Once we work around that, it's just like butchering cattle. It's not tough to slaughter these women. It's not a problem. And so, we'll deal with that. And we'll, that's the way we're dealing with it. I'm waiting to see this other story load, because I've known so many. I knew Steve Anderson a little bit. I think it was Steve Anderson who shot it out with the feds in Tennessee, and he used to go by the username of Bulldog Radio, and he had a radio show for a while, and I think it was a shortwave show, and he was one of these big, long bearded guys. He looks like this Victor D. Wayne White. I was defending and protecting my dignity and the sovereignty of my domain. He looks very much like this guy, Victor D. Wayne White. He was somewhat more successful than White, at evading the feds. Quite amazing how time flies, Only got a minute to go now. I'm kind of rambling here, but, I've put out my basic theory, and you're going to have to deal with it. We're going to create these refuges. We're going to deal with the problem. And, boy, they really smashed him up. You see, this is what happens, And, that's the way it goes. Nobody feels any sympathy for the guy. You won't find anyone with any sympathy with the guy. You won't see anybody rushing to defend him. Nobody in his hometown is going to defend him. And, I think he's pretty cooled. That's about all I can say. Victor D. Wayne White stopped firing his .308 rifle at the helicopters hovering over his compound. Why did they use the word compound? What does compound mean? Hovering over his compound, slugged back 3 or 4 shots at Wild Turkey, American Honey, and began strumming his guitar. That is as good a place as any to end the show. This is Breckenridge Elkins signing off. Stumble in Radio. Long live death.